After a very exciting morning discussion where we talked about target and pathway inhibition, we're now going to hone in on specific target inhibition and how one optimizes this by either identifying mutations or genetic aberrations. And it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Keith Flaherty, who's the director of our therapeutics at Mass General Cancer Center, Development Therapeutics. And Keith is going to tell us the BRAF story, which is a very interesting example of this targeted approach in oncology. Keith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to participate in this conference. It's a spectacular list of presenters other than myself, and it's great to have a conference that brings so many of our pharmaceutical sector colleagues to the table as well. I would never use a title that's quite this bold in other audiences, but at MGH, there's a bit of an arms race going on in terms of establishing that the targeted therapy success that you've been a part of, ranks in some way, and your New England Journal article is, maybe a hair better by a half a figure than your colleague down the hall. So what I'm getting at with this title is that unlike RAS, and still to the moment, I would say to some degree, PIK3CA, BRAF is now an oncogene which distributes across cancer to a fair degree, with 7 to 8% of all tumors having these mutations, where we have now seen clear evidence of single-agent responsiveness. And I'll try to make points along the way that hopefully spill out of melanoma, which has been the proof of concept disease area. So I'm going to focus on really the MAP kinase pathway as a whole, particularly in melanoma. In the setting of BRAF mutation, it's certainly a reasonable molecular/disease setting, and one that really has been the clinical proving ground for BRAF and MEK inhibitors. And I think a fair amount now has been learned to be able to make some conclusions. When BRAF was first discovered as an oncogene in 2002, I think the immediately relevant findings of even the first paper were that it's a severe hotspot event. So if you look at the peak here, sorry, this pointer I've been told, that's not so bad. This peak here in terms of where the activating mutations reside in the kinase domain made it seem quite clear that this is a common phenomenon, and there's clearly a hotspot going on here. The other point is that BRAF, being a serine threonine kinase, most importantly a kinase, was thought immediately potentially to be a therapeutic target. And so this obviously distinguishes it from RAS, which for a couple decades now has been staring us in the face, but not amenable to direct drug targeting still to date. Oops. So it's the case that BRAF is most commonly mutated in melanoma. Certainly that's a fair statement, and it's really that simple fact that has made that disease setting the clinical proving ground for the first and second generation BRAF inhibitors. But what we hope is that what we've uncovered in melanoma in terms of single-agent efficacy will ultimately somehow extend to other tumor types. But I don't mean to suggest that in a sort of simple-minded fashion. I would make it very clear on the next couple of slides that the mutations that accompany BRAF and melanoma are a different set of partners by and large compared to other tumor types. And so it's not a fair statement to assume that the role of the oncogene itself and then its therapeutic relevance is going to be immediately translatable to other tumors. But in total, the current estimate is about 8% of all cancers have these mutations, and I'm not listing on this slide some of the tumor types in which 1 to 2% of cases can harbor these mutations. One of our hopes at Mass General, by launching this broad-ranging genotyping effort clinically, is that we won't have to work towards finding those patients. Rather, passively, we'll pick up even the sort of low prevalence events in breast cancer, prostate cancer, and elsewhere, where they definitely exist. So the role of BRAF as an oncogene, I suppose you'd say, is not necessarily so different than its role as a constituent of the MAP kinase pathway. But it was clear at the time that BRAF was first discovered as an oncogene. Its expression is somewhat restricted to cells of neural crest origin. Certainly express this at very high levels, and melanocytes being of neural crest origin, then perhaps not a surprise that it would be featured as an oncogene within the pathway. But note, of course, from that previous list that numerous epithelial cancers have mutations in BRAF as well. The better studied counterpart, CRAF, is not nearly so restricted in terms of its expression. But nonetheless, when BRAF is mutated, it's quite clear that it will activate the MAP kinase pathway and seemingly do nothing else. And by what I mean by that is one can report out gene transcription changes when you induce a BRAF mutation that clearly are the readout of MAP kinase pathway activity. Conversely, if you inhibit either with siRNA or now with selective inhibitors, it's quite clear that BRAF and MEK silencing or drug targeting with selective inhibitors produce exactly the same profile in terms of downstream transcriptional changes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that drug targeting is going to work out to be exactly the same strategy for reasons that I'll jump into in just a moment. So as I suggested, the companions for BRAF in terms of other signal transduction pathways and specific oncogenes are alluded to here with too many references to include on one slide. By the time that BRAF mutations were discovered, we've already known that PTEN loss is fairly common in melanoma. The significance of that in all cases is still not entirely nailed down, and even a little, I would say, more tenuous is the AKT connection, where AKT3 seems to be amplified, fairly focally so in some tumors and fairly high levels in some tumors, but exactly which tumors truly activate the PI3 kinase pathway because of that phenomenon, the functional work, if you will, is still not entirely worked out. But it is fairly clear from this just sort of top-level genetic evidence the PI3 kinase pathway is somewhat important in melanoma. And in melanomas where NRAS mutations are found, that's about 20% of all cases, you won't find the same genetic aberrations in the PI3 kinase pathway. So sort of suggesting, if you will, that a hit in both pathways is critical, or in RAS itself. But overlying that, it appears in the vast majority of cases, are changes in P16 most commonly, either missense, nonsense mutations or deletions, cyclin D amplification, CDK4 amplification, and even in some cases activating mutation will happen often concomitantly with BRAF. So I'm partly laying out this to distinguish melanoma to some degree from other tumor types, where colorectal cancer, for example, one can see hard evidence that PIK3CA is mutated. We don't have those events in melanoma, but perhaps some of the same pathways ultimately are driving each tumor. But in terms of drug targeting, I partly meant to show this slide to emphasize that there are clearly other pathways that we know well and hopefully can target in the near future that are concomitantly activated with BRAF. And it sets some limit in terms of an expectation for what single-agent BRAF targeting can do. This is not a genetically simple tumor by any means. Another observation which really casts a lot of doubt about the idea that BRAF could be a useful therapeutic target in advanced disease is the fact that it's a very early phenomenon. Now, we don't have very many patients who actually march through the progression that's shown here, a benign nevus to a dysplastic nevus to an invasive melanoma. There are some, but the clinical entities of a benign nevus will commonly, very commonly, have a BRAF mutation. In fact, whereas we would estimate metastatic patients to have about a 50 to 60% likelihood, about 80% likely in a benign nevus to have a BRAF mutation, and NRAS is also found separately in benign nevi. So these are very early events. And clinically, these lesions will form and then basically halt in terms of growth and stay in that state for decades' time, generally never going on to become melanoma. We think that's probably the clinical equivalent to what happens in vitro, which is you introduce a BRAF mutation, you get a little burst of proliferation and then senescence. So we think that some of the other genetic alterations, not necessarily the ones shown here, are basically unable to or able to surpass that checkpoint of sorts and overcome senescence to drive proliferation once again. Fairly clear genetic evidence that the P16RB axis becomes aberrant in the clinical entity of dysplastic nevus, and now more recent evidence that invasiveness is actually the moniker of PI3 kinase pathway activation. Experimentally, if one basically activates the PI3 kinase pathway in the setting of BRAF mutation in fairly credible models of superficial melanoma in mice, you can convert to invasiveness. And transgenic models actually most recently have supported that as well. Now, despite being a very, very early event, the early evidence that we have, and by early I mean at ASCO 2010, we saw the first relatively convincing data that would suggest that BRAF mutation, present in about half of all of our metastatic patients, may be a poor prognostic factor. So this is a metastatic population comparing outcome between consecutive series of patients, admittedly not very large, about 160 patients in total in this panel, but again, it was consecutive patients evaluated at one center in Australia. And the patients with the BRAF mutation had an inferior outcome compared to the patients who were wild type. Of course, many of them have NRAS mutations. And you might think, well, why wouldn't NRAS and BRAF just ultimately serve the same oncogenic function? And I don't have a great answer for that. But the relevance of this finding is that while not definitive, I think it would support the notion that a BRAF mutant population is not a good prognostic group, right? So as we look now at single-agent BRAF inhibitors and the clinical outcome in just a moment, I think it's safe to say that they're either running with the rest of the pack or perhaps, if this data is correct, a little worse off. So the drugs, and I'm not going to go through every one on the list, have broken now into multiple groups. We have so-called selective BRAF inhibitors. I say so-called because they're not perfectly selective for BRAF. In some assays, as imperfect as they may be, you can demonstrate CRAF antagonism, at least in isolated kinase assays. There's far less selective agents, sorafenib being the first amongst them, but RAF 265 and XL281, like sorafenib, albeit them more potent against BRAF and CRAF for that matter, are VEGF receptor inhibitors, have PDGF receptor antagonism in their profiles. How relevant that is in terms of the doses that are now being administered clinically, yet to be determined. But one can enumerate two fairly distinct classes of drugs now emerging, with several more entering clinical development now in the very near future. MEK inhibitors, on the other hand, all of the ones that have been evaluated clinically, especially in melanoma, are allosteric inhibitors, very, very selective for their target. And as I suggested before, we know of no output for oncogenic BRAF other than activating MEK and then downstream components of the MAP kinase pathway. So you might then assume a priori that this might be one instance in the landscape of oncogene targeting in cancer where downstream targeting could actually equate to direct oncogene antagonism, which I would argue is a precedent that's not yet been set in any other therapeutic area in oncology. Having said that, there are issues that will come up in terms of the therapeutic index, tumor tissue to normal tissue, I think, that ultimately make that statement not quite the case. So sorafenib made the point for us in trials that we conducted in the early years after the identification of BRAF mutation that having an agent that is somewhat potent is obviously desirable, but selectivity probably becomes quite critical. So sorafenib being a BRAF, CRAF, VEGF receptor inhibitor, amongst a few others, in these 6 patients with BRAF mutation, metastatic melanoma, participating in a single-agent sorafenib trial, we were able to demonstrate some degree of inhibition if you judge phosphor as a readout of the pathway, but fairly modest. Now, we didn't know at the time how much inhibition one needed to have, and I would argue even now we don't have that quantitation nailed down even in vitro systems. But now we know with more selective agents that we can achieve much more profound inhibition of phosphor in clinical biopsy specimens taken, in fact, at the same time points as we did in this early study. So sorafenib ultimately was, at its maximum tolerated doses, unable to completely inhibit the pathway, or at least come close to that. And that likely accounted for the fact that not only did we not see single-agent efficacy, but couldn't demonstrate it in combination with chemotherapy. So in a very large cooperative group study, which was the final chapter, which we just presented at ASCO this year, sorafenib, by no measure, improves outcome in metastatic melanoma here in combination with chemotherapy. Why did we go this far when we didn't see single-agent efficacy? Well, simply because, frankly, there was a lot of doubt about whether single-agent BRAF targeting could ever have standalone efficacy. And so we thought, well, maybe this is going to be a little bit more like the HER2/neu targeting story, where there might be some hints, but mostly in combination with chemotherapy. I'm not trying to blur that rather complicated story to breast cancer specialists who are in the room, but suffice to say we thought it might need help, if you will. Now, more selective agents have emerged, and when I say more selective, here's PLX4032 with great potency against BRAF, and I'll admit that actually in this Nature Biotechnology paper they didn't actually have BRAF as one of the target kinases, but just sort of showing you the broad spectrum of sorafenib against the receptor tyrosine kinases particularly. BRAF is sort of amidst this, somewhere between the primary and secondary targets of that agent, whereas more professional agents that were engineered after the discovery of BRAF as an oncogene are possible, especially if one is training their activity against mutated BRAF, which was the case for this compound. And this drug, unlike less selective agents, including sorafenib, has not only selectivity in isolated kinase assays, but once you move to cell systems in much larger panels than what I'm alluding to here, you see very selective effects where you see induction of apoptosis in BRAF mutant lines and really no effect whatsoever in terms of perturbing cell fate in cancer cells that lack a BRAF mutation. They could have a RAS mutation, they could have other mutations outside of the pathway altogether, and you won't see an effect. So again, broaden this out to many, many, many cell lines have been characterized, and this pattern repeats itself. And then take that up to in vivo experiments, the significance of which beyond just the cell line data would say, well, this doesn't seem like it would be a stromal effect, if you will, something other than tumor cell targeting, because it is very clear that all of the efficacy is in BRAF mutant models, again, when you broaden this out to many, many models beyond just the two that I'm showing you here. So this selectivity in terms of the context in which BRAF sits, the cellular context, if you will, is the unique moniker of these drugs, and would further support the notion that sorafenib and potentially agents like it aren't able to so cleanly inhibit the target at deliverable doses. But ultimately, we do induce toxicity. So to think of this drug as a drug that only targets mutated BRAF would certainly be a fallacy, because mutated BRAF is in tumor cells and perhaps a handful of nevi around someone's body, but not in the tissues otherwise that are mediating toxicity like rash and photosensitivity, which are somewhat coupled, arthralgia, and even frank arthritis in some cases. I can't pretend that we understand the mechanistic basis of this perfectly, although I'll suggest one in just a moment. And fatigue, which is a relatively nonspecific finding and not entirely clear still if that's treatment-related as opposed to disease burden-related. But we also observed in a significant subset of patients, if I can just build, thank you, the emergence of cutaneous squamous cell carcinomas, typically 1 or 2 lesions in an individual patient, most commonly histopathologically characterized as keratoacanthomas. These are relatively common phenomenon, clearly drug-related, and they would appear about 1 to 2 months into treatment typically. And interestingly, across a population of patients treated, they would crest the incidence around that time and then fall. So the patients who were still on therapy beyond, let's say, 6 months, you wouldn't typically see new lesions appear. So it's relatively early in the course of treatment. And why might this happen? Well, this goes back to the issue about targeting within one pathway, not necessarily having the same consequences. So it turns out that in the absence of a BRAF mutation, which is what I'm alluding to with this figure that I lifted from one of Richard Murray's papers, this is one of the 3 papers that described this finding in the beginning of 2010. Oh, sorry, if I can go back one slide. Thank you. In the absence of a BRAF mutation, whether the pathway itself is wild type or in the setting of a RAS mutation, a selective BRAF inhibitor that inhibits the kinase activity of BRAF actually forces dimerization of BRAF and CRAF, actually stimulating CRAF activity, hyperstimulating it, if you will, and therefore upregulating the pathway. This is not a phenomenon that happens in the tumor cell that has a BRAF mutation where, if you will, the pathway is wired to dependence on BRAF, but in other tissues you get this upregulation. And the significance of this in terms of the appearance of those keratoacanthomas, we think, is that it's been known now for a couple of decades that squamous cell carcinoma of the skin fairly commonly can harbor HRAS mutations. And since that actually seems to be a particularly potent interactor with this biology based on the published data in vitro, we think it's probably the case that amongst the keratinocyte population, people accumulate HRAS mutations over time, and then you introduce this drug, and some of them then will proliferate through the MAP kinase pathway as a consequence. So in terms of the tumor, that's where the story will wrap up over the next several slides and focus on what are the therapeutic directions to move forward with. We saw remarkably reliable effects in terms of early perturbing of tumor viability and survival. Here's PET scans at day 15, where in fact in the cohort of patients that we treated after completing dose escalation, 32 BRAF mutant patients, we saw a PET response, if we borrow from lymphoma and lung cancer criteria, in every single case. So early responses, very reliably observed, and I show this slide also to enumerate the fact that just about any tissue site is capable of responding, and that the responses are really quite uniform, not just on PET scans, but on subsequent CAT scans as well. You don't see mixed responses. You don't have sort of a clone hanging out in a lung lesion that grows while all others shrink. No, everything seems to go down at least early in concert. Next slide, please. Thank you. And here's the waterfall plot that actually looks at a little bit of a later time point, 2 months into treatment, where by that time you actually do lose a couple patients with lack of efficacy in terms of tumor progression, but only a couple amongst these patients, all of whom received the so-called phase 2 dose. The rest of the patients showing you some degree of tumor responsiveness. Oh, I'm sorry, back one. But by no means complete in most cases. We do have a couple complete responders in this set and in subsequent data to be presented on Thursday of this week in Sydney. That's been reproduced now in the phase 2 trial, but otherwise you see this cascade here of greater or lesser degrees of tumor regression. I'll just remind you again that we know about pathway activation in the PI3 kinase pathway, some degree dysfunction of the P16RB axis, and we wonder whether those or other mediators might be what's holding up these tumors. That's basically not allowing us to achieve complete response. And you might say, well, you're getting awfully greedy for a tumor that hasn't had any good therapies for the past several decades to be looking immediately for complete response, but just trying to point to the future of what our work is focused on now. Durability of response, and I would say this is not entirely unusual in solid tumor oncology, is by no means enough to call this a victory even for just this half of the melanoma population. Some of these responses are quite short-lived. I mean, a response represented here in the diamonds over time, followed by progression just a couple of months later, is hard to term a clinical benefit. However, there are clearly patients in the setting of metastatic melanoma, you make it beyond 6 months with a response, and that's quite remarkable in a disease where the median survival time is 6 to 9 months in clinical trial populations. You'd say that a significant number of these patients are getting a clear benefit, and longer follow-up on some of the phase 1 patients would suggest, in fact, that even 2 years of responsiveness and continuing can be achieved in some patients. So what mediates resistance, obviously, is critical, and Levi Garraway later today will actually go into that in some detail. So improving on single-agent BRAF inhibition, just in my closing few comments here, I'll just highlight a couple of points. We're probably not done within pathway, if I can have the next slide. Within the MAP kinase pathway, it's fairly clear that although we have profound inhibition early in the course of treatment, you clearly still see some residual MAP kinase pathway activity judged by ERK itself or downstream readouts, cyclin D expression or Ki67. I will note that we've seen this reproducibly. Here's a series of endothelial cells around a blood vessel showing you really marked upregulation. This is a separate blood vessel, of course, before treatment, connoting the fact that we really do see this phenomenon of upregulation of the MAP kinase pathway in cells that lack a BRAF mutation, be they endothelial cells or adjacent keratinocytes, which I'm not showing you on this slide. But you still see some tumor cells scattered in there that clearly have some detectable ERK phosphorylation. And in vitro, it's fairly clear now that even little bits of output of the pathway are still enough to keep some cells alive. So one of the immediate hypotheses is if we go back to the panel of drugs that are in development right now, maybe we could actually come up with a strategy for combining some of these agents to try to further drive down signaling in the pathway, to which you would say, well, that's crazy. It's going to be toxic. You're never going to get away with that. But remember that we have the effect of these pathways being, these inhibitors being a little different depending on the context. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, before I get to that, just a couple of other comments. We have another drug, actually just about a year behind in clinical development, that's shown very similar efficacy, another selective BRAF inhibitor, and really critically in terms of clinical value, this drug has been studied to some degree in patients with brain metastases not treated with other modalities. The very most common way in which patients with melanoma can die ultimately is with brain escape of tumors. But regression in brain metastases was reported in actually 10 out of 10 patients treated at the end of the phase 1 trial with this agent. So probably all sanctuaries of disease, in fact, can be targeted with this approach. And here's the waterfall plot of those brain metastases, just sort of corroborating the fact that you see reliable early effects. MEK inhibitors have actually, in previous years, been somewhat disappointing, and I think that's partly because of the issue of one inhibiting the pathway in both the wild type and BRAF mutant context, and therefore probably getting toxicity that's truly pathway dependent in normal tissues. But the best of the MEK inhibitors so far in terms of efficacy comes also from GlaxoSmithKline. And here's just the brief snapshot of the data, the waterfall plot, showing an unprecedented response that doesn't quite match the BRAF inhibitors, admittedly, but still is actually coming somewhat close with even some complete responses. So again, moving forward in terms of thinking about combinations, the first combination trial we've been able to lift off the ground with actually combines a selective BRAF inhibitor from GSK with their selective MEK inhibitor, remembering that, if we go to the next slide, got to build that one more, there we go, that BRAF inhibitor by itself will hyperactivate the MAP kinase pathway in tissues that lack a BRAF mutation. But if you come in with a MEK inhibitor, you might actually be able to counter this phenomenon in the normal tissue. In the tumor tissue, we hope that, in fact, we're getting two measures of inhibition against the pathway and therefore maybe able to drive down signaling to even lower levels while potentially having this canceling effect in normal cells. Now, of course, we're cognizant of these other genetic alterations, and the good news is that an even longer list of drugs have emerged from phase 1 testing already, targeting some of the components in the PI3 kinase pathway, as you've already heard from others, and even now an increasing number that hit some of the cyclin-dependent kinases that we think might be most critical in melanoma. So combinations across pathways, if you will certainly be a feature in melanoma, as you'll continue to hear in other disease settings where these pathways are relevant. So just concluding, and just build this slide with a couple more advances, please. Thank you. And two more. There we go. So combinations outside of that, of course, may be of interest. So it could be that BRAF inhibition is our version of cytotoxic therapy upon which we think about building further with anti-angiogenic therapy. In fact, there's a randomized phase 2 trial that will launch relatively near future testing that combination. And immunotherapy actually may be quite rational in combination with this approach for reasons that I'll build on in the next slide. Chemotherapy, not so much. Based on preclinical evidence, it doesn't really look like there's a lot going on there. And with chemotherapy drugs having a 5 to 10% response rate in melanoma, I would say that's probably about the weakest group of agents to be thinking about partnering with on just purely clinical grounds. But actually, Jen Wargo here at MGH published the first and really intriguing report in Cancer Research this summer, suggesting that if one blocks the MAP kinase pathway in BRAF mutant melanomas with either a MEK inhibitor, as shown here, or a BRAF inhibitor, selective BRAF inhibitor, a tool compound from the Plexicon series, you get marked upregulation of melanocyte antigens, this being MART1 shown here in this figure. So suggesting, in fact, that escaping immune surveillance might actually be the direct consequence of oncogene activity in certain tumor types. And in melanoma, we think that may be the case. And it turns out that if you look at what the effect is on T cells that are capable of recognizing these tumor-specific antigens, these are actually T cells from the very same patient whose tumor was treated ex vivo with a MEK and BRAF inhibitor. A MEK inhibitor will poison the MAP kinase pathway in the lymphocytes and actually somewhat shut down their ability to respond when they are confronted with the tumor, and therefore they won't put out interferon nearly so well as the tumors that are co-treated with the Plexicon drug. So in other words, the tumor cells and the immune cells, the tumor cells have this response that's indicative of their pathway dependence of upregulating antigen, whereas you don't really perturb the T cells at all because they don't use BRAF to activate the pathway. And in fact, as I've shown you before, you might actually hyperstimulate these cells, at least to some degree. So just my concluding slide, it's obviously critical that we establish the mechanisms of primary and secondary resistance, and having seen this program put together when I was invited, I decided to let Levi use his time to focus our group efforts in the MGH Harvard melanoma arena to understand mechanisms of resistance, and he has some nice results to highlight. As I've suggested, going outside of some of the pathways that we've known about for some time in melanoma may have some relevance. And ultimately, we're going to be targeting the idea that there's multiple pathways to go after up front, also trying to understand acquired resistance to try to develop a rationale for sequential therapy. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Keith. I'll just get started, and this is going to your question of resistance here. You know, if you look at your duration of response with the Plexicon drug, the duration of response is very variable. Is there any tumor tissue from the clinical trial which you already have, and maybe Levi will be telling us about this later, where you can get to the question of mechanisms of resistance and then doing kind of combination treatments going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, we've sort of divided the world into so-called primary and secondary resistance. So we have certainly baseline tumors on all these patients because we determine their BRAF mutation status. We've at least isolated DNA to work with, and perhaps no more than that for many of these patients. So the low-hanging fruit hypotheses are to look at the other genetic alterations that I described in these cohorts of patients and understand if that actually predicts outcome to some degree. I would say a more precious commodity is the ability to biopsy patients at the time of clinical progression, which, unlike in lung cancer where it's a bit of a challenge, doable, but a challenge in melanoma, it's not necessarily so hard with more superficial manifestations of disease. So we are accumulating a larger and larger bank of those tumors to understand what's different comparing pre-treatment and post-treatment. So we have some early hints, and I'll just say that the only thing we can comment on, not just in our group, but the others who are working on this area clinically, is that novel BRAF mutations do not seem to emerge in any of the samples that have been characterized to date. It seems to be MAP kinase pathway restoration, but not new BRAF mutations.
Keith, you mentioned that the response is homogeneous, which is, I think, gratifying. Right. That is the PET and CT response. What about the relapse? I think that would be very interesting to know whether it's similarly homogeneous or heterogeneous.
Yeah, it's generally not. So it's generally heterogeneous, and the histogram looks a bit like a Fibonacci series. So the most common pattern of progression is a single lesion progressing. The patient starts with 10 or 20 clearly radiographically evident tumors. All of them will go down to some degree, stay at some plateau typically unless they had a complete response, and then a single lesion will progress most commonly. Pre-existing lesion as opposed to new lesion, aka microscopic lesion that now becomes clinically evident. Next most common is a couple of those lesions and then on down the series. So generally it's not all of them going down and all of them coming back up.
That's a great talk. As a neuro-oncologist, as you can see, I'm very excited about the response in the brain metastasis scenario. Can you comment on the duration of the response? I know it's very preliminary, but
yeah,
if you know something, that'd
so
be great.
far it seems to match the systemic response. So by that I mean if you looked at the waterfall plot and overlap it for the patients with treated brain metastases and look at their systemic metastases as well, they go down. So the complete responses happened in people who had complete responses elsewhere or near complete elsewhere. So the magnitude initially and then also the duration of response seems to really mirror the systemic disease. So it doesn't seem to be behaving differently, at least with the GSK drug, which is what I was referring to. With PLX, we actually haven't yet treated patients with previously untreated brain metastases. So it's going to work that will begin soon to know if there's a difference between the drugs in that regard.
Did you have a question? We have a minute. We answered it.
Okay.
Thanks, Keith.